The answer to what's wrong with America. So I want you to imagine it's 1910 in England. And if you're in 2025 America, that's really not going to be too hard of a stretch, as you're about to see. So England was basically at a boiling point in society. They had mass immigration tensions where a lot of Eastern European Jews were fleeing persecution from Russia and places like that into the London's East End. The Aliens Act of 1905 basically created this modern law, which for the first time, it allowed people to block immigration because of undesirables in society. Essentially, they didn't want poor people. And B, for the first time in, as far as I'm aware, English history, it allowed them to expel the undesirables if they were able to sneak through. It created a lot of public debate and rage, and it divided the nation. There were overcrowded cities. The infrastructure couldn't keep up with the influx of immigration. There was industrialization, which London at that time was essentially the economic manufacturing powerhouse. But all these groups of people created shortages, rampant diseases, and whole groups of people just kind of fell through society's cracks. You had women's rights. So women, in particular, trying to fight for the right to vote and women's suffrage, it was a complete paradigm shift at that time. And they're often met with violence, imprisonment, fierce resistance from the establishment. It divided the nation. You had extreme political tensions. You had violence and sabotage from movements like the suffragettes. You had the Irish freedom movement, who would have bombings, and you'd have labor unions that would create riots. And you'd have the fringe ideologies that started popping up. And these are like the real ones, like the actual Marxists, where it was more actual communists and socialists and eventually fascists down the road. But this isn't like the label that we toss around today. These were like the real ones, and it divided the nation. You had class divides and tensions where the aristocracy, I don't even know how you say that word. Basically, they saw themselves as the engines of society, and they should be the ones that, because they're investing into the future and the stability and tradition of the nation, that they're going to be the ones that increasingly are the ones that should hold the power. But then you had another movement where the laborers in the Labor Party, they felt like, no, we're the engine of the future. And you had this tension there where it was this economic class trying to move up an economic class in that time almost was completely unattainable. You had child labor laws, and you had this unchecked power of the aristocracy, and both sides were convinced that their side was preserving the future of the nation in the best of ways, and divided the nation. You had national deficits because England was bleeding from controversial foreign wars like the Boer War. And at the same time, you have a rising power in what's present-day Germany that was threatening a continental conflict, and eventually that would turn into World War I. And so it divided the nation. You have a battle over who defined truth, because now you started seeing advances in science and philosophy, and it directly challenged the Anglican Church and the church as a whole, and basically confronted the traditional faith answer of who defines truth and what is truth. And so you had a cultural tension that started to happen, and kind of a battle for the moral compass of the culture, and it divided the nation. And then you had a constitutional crisis. In 1910, the elected commons had basically the lords, they crashed over the lords and the commons were conflicting over taxation and social reforms and how much of a basement should we give people, and raising the question of how powerful should the government be, and truly who does hold the authority. And it divided the nation. So there are all these things that are pretty much the same place that feels like in 2025 America, but I haven't touched on things like child labor, school funding, public health epidemics. There's all these things that kept on popping up that we can relate to as well in 2025 America. And all of it basically pointed to feeling like society is about to collapse. And there's a story where a reporter from the Times of London wrote out to G.K. Chesterton, and he asked them, hey, GK, you're a man of faith. What's wrong with the world? And GK wrote back, and I don't know if this is true or not, but this is how this legend goes. He goes, I am. And it's something that really most people don't expect, because everybody expects a pointed finger. But the same is true for modern day America. We have a lot of political tension. We have a lot of cultural battles, social battles. But the root of these significant problems that I can actually deal with, they don't start out there where I'm pointing the finger at. It starts with me in the mirror. It starts at my home. So the answer to what's wrong with America, I am. And if I want a stronger America, I better start with me and my home. If you want a better America, you better start with you and your home.